ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome the moderator of the session, Rikard Jozwiak.
Hello guys, I'm Rikard Jozwiak and I have a big problem. The very first panel I ever moderated was a small panel in Brussels 10 years ago. The title of that panel was Western Balkans at Crossroads, between East and West. And here I am, 10 years later, bigger stage, Globsec. And what is the title of the panel? Clearly, I am lost. Seems like Western Balkans is lost as well. So to help me, to maybe help Western Balkans, I have not one, but 4 Sherpas, 3 presidents and a baroness. Surely we must find a way today. So please welcome on stage President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, President Milo Đukanović, President Stevo Pendarovski, and Baroness Catherine Ashton. So, we only have 40 minutes, and I really want you guys to participate. And there are 2 ways you can do it. There's the modern way, it's via Slido. You have it on your app. And there's the old-fashioned way. You raise a hand, and I have 2 microphones coming up here somewhere. Also, Mr. Đukanović will be speaking in the most beautiful language, Montenegrin. And you will have, for those of you who don't understand it, you will have a translation piece somewhere. I don't know where mine is, but it should be around everywhere for those who can't know it. So, anyway, let's start. It was 11 years ago. Okay, it works? It was the last time we had an enlargement. It was your country, Madam President. Since then, not much has been going on. And now you're an EU member, and I know that Croatia is very pro-enlargement, especially to Western Balkans, always pushing for it. But my question is the following. In the EU, is it really true that everyone is as enthusiastic as Croatia when it comes to Western Balkans? Is it really such a consensus? Or is there not a complacency and some people who want to slow this process down and are not really ready for this yet?
Yes, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. The enlargement fatigue, as we have called it, is nothing new. I mean, we experienced it after the 5th enlargement wave, and I've been on the other side, and I know how frustrating it is. When we were trying to start negotiations with the European Union and with the slow progress. And that really reflected back on our own society and the fact that we started losing popular support for EU accession, which meant not just EU accession because it was not a goal in itself, but it meant also losing enthusiasm for the difficult political, economic, and other reforms that had to be conducted in the country. In our case, I think we had no doubt. The closer you are to accession, the more people start to think, is that what we really want, or would it be better? Would we be better off on our own? But we had no doubt. However, we have a different situation today with stalling of the process of EU accession, where we're creating dangerous political vacuums in our neighboring countries that are being filled by third parties who are not necessarily benevolent to the region and the stability, peace, and prosperity in the region. So the enlargement fatigue, which has to be addressed by proper information and public diplomacy on the benefits of enlargement of the EU, not just for the countries who have joined, but for the EU as a whole, has to be strengthened, as well as countering disinformation. And definitely people or countries need to start making more progress on the formal way to the European Union. Otherwise, feelings develop, oh, no matter what we do, we're still not good enough to them.
You mentioned third forces, third countries. Anyone particular in mind?
Russia, of course, comes to mind. And quite honestly, If I were in the position of the Russian leadership, I'd want to open another front that would take away at least part of the attention of the European Union and NATO from Ukraine. But they're not the only ones. There are other countries or elements that are at sub or supra-country level that would like to influence the processes in what is commonly known as the Western Balkans, and I don't really like the term, because I think that the Balkans itself as a connotation makes everybody think, oh, do I really want Balkans in my own house? So I prefer to call the region Southeast Europe. I do understand those who say that they're proud Balkan people. However, we have to start rethinking strategies and the whole approach to the region, because it has two great potentials. One is to do good very quickly, and in contrast to some other regions who have experienced conflict and instability, we have been able to end the wars and work on reconciliation, reintegration, and resolving the open issues. But there is the second big potential, and that is to descend into turmoil and bloodshed very quickly as well. And that potential should not be disregarded, thinking, okay, now we have peace, security, and more or less a military balance, and of course NATO that guarantees the security umbrella for most of our countries. However, one spark could ignite crisis that, you know, I don't believe it would go back to what we had in the 90s, the scope of the wars in the 90s, but nevertheless could still continue to destabilize not just the region, but the European Union and the whole of the transatlantic area.
President Đukanović, you come from the country that is the front runner, but you have also been running for quite a long time. For 12 years now, negotiations, all chapters open, a handful chapters closed. For how much longer are you going to run? We heard the current president of Montenegro say we will be number 28 in 28. Are you as optimistic?
Da, u slučaju Crne Gore taj proces
Of Montenegro, this process has been taking quite some time, and it has already been producing certain effects that in the end can result in serious discouragement of the public about whether we will achieve that goal, membership in the European Union. In the preparation for this panel, you said that more or less we find ourselves at the same crossroad as 10 years ago when you moderated one of similar panels in Brussels. Unfortunately, you are right. And very often when I talk about this, I say that today European values seem to be more poorly accepted in the Western Balkans than 10 years ago. But let us first tackle the essence of what you asked in your question. I think the two things should be taken into account. First, the process of taking the societies in the Western Balkans or Southeastern Europe out from their historical situation where they lag behind in democracy and economy, it's a long process. It's much longer than the negotiation in the European Union. And it's much longer than what it takes to get the final green light in certain chapters. So it is the process of emancipation of the societies. And that process will take longer than any negotiations. And at the same time, we have to know that in the societies in the Western Balkans, you don't have some political divisions who advocate the same political goals. No. You still have a very sharp conflict in the Western Balkans between two ideas. One is the multi-ethnic democracy and Balkan nationalism on the other side. So when the structures in power change, it's not just the persons that change and continue working on the same goal and strategies. No, they keep undermining the strategy when you have change in power. That's what we have in Montenegro in the last 4 years. And it's logical. The structures in power changed. I mean, that's democratic maturity of a society, and that's okay. But what we didn't have to have is that there is a disruption of the hard work on closing the chapters. We had the situation where the European part was questioned. So definitely we need more time than what is behind us. But the second thing is that in that time, we didn't have consistent and needed support from the European Union. According to what I remember from the time of managing the political processes, in Montenegro we had 3 stages. The first stage happened after the end of the wars, when the countries of Central and Eastern Europe were already members of the European Union and when we were very enthusiastic to become a member of the European Union. European Union at that time already had very strong voices talking about enlargement fatigue. So that was the first stage. The second stage was the stage of obstructing the whole process of enlargement. So there were different speeds discussed, political community discussed as a kind of substitute for membership in the European Union. They never said it clearly, but basically they were buying time to lower the pressure of the countries of the Western Balkans and their wish to become members of the European Union. And then we see the third stage. In my opinion, it was the completely wrong politics of the West towards the Western Balkans. That is the policy that realistically created space for restoration of the most retrograde political ideas in the recent history of the Western Balkans. So, in the 90s, you had those ideas. They wanted to change the borders. They wanted to swap territories. And the goal was, instead of the current configuration of states, we should establish a smaller number of states that would be ethnically homogeneous. And the nationalists always had that idea. They keep saying that multi-ethnic democracy in the Western Balkans is not possible. And they say that that's why we can't have stability, and that if we change the borders and if we have homogenization, then we will have stability. So today, those ideas are still strong. And they are restored, in my opinion, thanks to the foreign influence. The most important is the Russian influence, of course. As Grabar-Kitarović said, Russia tries in that way to achieve their legitimate interest in our region. But the problem is that the Western policy was such in the past that realistically it helped restoration of those ideas that are retrograde. And I think that those ideas lead the regional political process in the Western Balkans and realistically threaten to undermine stability of the Western Balkans as the fundamental value that we achieved in the past.
I'm a Montenegrin voter. I've seen that it's taken 12 years to just open chapters, which is easier than closing them. Why shouldn't I be attractive to these alternative names? Oh, sorry, alternative names, alternative ideas, and so on. I mean, it's quite natural to me.
I can agree with you. I mean, that's why I emphasized how important it is to have continuous and comprehensive support from the European Union to that process, because it's not only in the interest of the Western Balkans. It is primarily the interest of the European Union. If the European Union wants to be stable and reinforce its system of values, and if it wants to be competitive on the geopolitical level, if it is not such, then it is subject to the influence of other politics. It's important the geopolitical vacuum does not exist. If you don't have sufficient influence of the European Union, then you will have influence of Russia. And Russia has used this very successfully. So today, values in the Western Balkans are devastated. We have to notice that. And that's why I'm saying that the situation is worse now than 10 years ago. And the Western policy today absolutely supports strengthening of the retrograde policies, which is a paradox. You have a very sharp front of the West in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they are preventing development of the Russian world, whose idea is to secure the geopolitical counterbalance and to ensure the importance of Russia from the time of the Cold War. I mean, there is a war about that. But in the Western Balkans, Western policies actually support something that is a copy of the Russian world, and that is development of the Serbian world in the region of the Western Balkans. That is strengthening of greater state nationalism, which is not isolated. Because in the Western Balkans, if you have one nationalism development, then the other will develop as well. And that leads to instability. And that led to 130,000 deaths in the 90s. So, in my opinion, all of this is a consequence of absence of a continuous and comprehensive support of the European Union. And let me just be very clear. I'm not talking about financial support. You will hear from Brussels, you want European money. No, it's not about the money. We need support in those countries to reshape public opinion, which is logically lagging behind, because it's historical, economic, and democratic lagging behind. And we have to deal for our public to recognize the benefits in the system of European values and not in some other system. You just said it's logical that the voters are hesitating. They don't see the clear prospects of membership in the EU, and they don't like uncertainty. And if they live in uncertainty, then they easily accept populist ideas. And we have this problem not only in the Balkans today, but in Europe as well, and in the United States. It's very clear. We need to have a serious strategic support from the European Union, which, in my belief, and I have been involved in politics for a long time, it was not continuous, it was not sufficiently comprehensive for all the time.
Segue to North Macedonia. We have the front runner here, but for many years, North Macedonia was sort of the best student in the class. You got brilliant reports from the European Commission, yet, as of today, you have still not opened a single chapter. There's been Greek vetoes, there has been, let's call it a French veto, and then there's been a Bulgarian veto. So isn't this a perfect example that, you know, the EU, in fact, isn't particularly serious about this?
Good afternoon to everybody. You have said at the very beginning that the Montenegro is the front runner in the last 12 years, and of course without the slightest intention to diminish the results of our friends in Montenegro, but we have been the front runners in the region on par with Croatia 20 years ago. In 2005, at that time, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia got the candidate status. And do not forget that last year we have celebrated, if that is the right term, 20 years since the Thessaloniki Agenda, when for the first time in one European Union document, the full membership for all the countries of the Western Balkans have been mentioned. And we are entering the third decade of that pledges, and nothing has happened after the latest entry into the European Union, let's say from the broader Western Balkan region, after the entry of Croatia into the European Union. You have mentioned several vetoes, some of them are informal, like the French veto. That was the demand on the part of the French president, that side in 2020, to have better methodology. Allegedly, the lagging behind of the region was because of the methodology. Of course, that was not true. That was never true. In my view, the lagging behind on the European Union path of the Western Balkans is mostly on the European Union part. Saying that, I wouldn't like to justify any wrongdoings being on the part of the local leaderships, in the regional leaderships. It's more than clear that we have not completed our homework. But tell me how it is possible in the past 10 or 11 years, no one from the Western Balkans not to succeed towards the European Union, and Montenegro is negotiating about 12 years, Serbia is with a similar period of time in that, formally in that process, and no one is even nearing the end of that long path. And no one should be surprised that in the meantime, the enthusiasm of our people, I can speak about North Macedonia with relevant numbers, enthusiasm of the people has been plummeting down in the past several years since the latest blockade on that part started to happen. We have been in the high 70s or high 80s, people being in favor of the EU full-fledged membership. Today, we have less than 50. that is unbelievably low for the country which has not only been the front runner in the procedural terms, but being always with the main feature, being one of the main pro-European and pro-Western countries. We have very specific internal structure. We have a lot of minorities. We have a quarter of the population ethnic Albanians. We are bordering both Kosovo and Serbia. Probably because of that, most of the people saw European Union or Europe without borders as a kind of a recipe to have the inter-ethnic coexistence, to have good living, good standard of living. And unfortunately, we have put everything. We have, as our former Prime Minister said once, we have played all in. And we failed on that exam. We have been the best student in the class. Unfortunately, now we failed that exam. And I cannot see any light at the end of this very long tunnel. At present, European Union is not dealing with the Western Balkans. And to speak more broadly and to take into consideration the broader passage of time, since 9/11, United States of America has done what it has done in the Western Balkans or in the Balkans and left the region with there with the symbolic diplomatic presence, and that's not enough. Without the serious EU leverage, then no one on the part of the Western Balkan leaderships, regardless whether they are from the left or from the right, from the center, is not capable in a short period of time to undertake all the reforms necessary to near the European average, speaking about the values, speaking about the standards, not only the standards of living, but speaking about the rule of law, speaking about the fight against corruption or organized crime. So within that process of Europeanization, it has always been the case, the countries prosper, including the values. We are not speaking about the money. My colleague Milo said precisely, we are not asking only for the European Union funds, cohesion funds, IPA funds. We are speaking about the values. We do need political values as well. That's the reason why we wouldn't like to be the members of the European market only. Would like to be the full-fledged member in the European political institutions. Do not forget, speaking for my country, we have no prior democratic experience. We have been the part of former Yugoslavia, which has not been a democratic entity, never been the state in a modern sense before that. So we do need that lessons or political practices or good political practices to be taken from the Western European countries and from the United States of America. They are nowhere to be seen. The whole process of the European integration is now, today, has been concentrated on ticking the boxes in a bureaucratic manner. We do not need that. We need the meaningful policy on the part of the European Union towards the Western Balkans. How it is possible, I'm going to conclude with this, the country which has changed its name to enter NATO and to enter the European Union, to be stuck in that process. And today, if you ask Macedonian citizens, no one can tell you what is ahead of us and for how long we should wait finally to enter, to be there, to reach that final destination.
Okay, a short question here then. The EU finally sees that, listen, it is too hard to reform ourselves because we have all these vetoes, and in order to get rid of the vetoes, there will be someone who's vetoing that. So we'll throw you this bone instead. Everything but institutions. Will you accept it? It's for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I would like to say
integrated into energy, integrated into markets.
No, that's not going to be helpful to us. And we can become the member of the European market. What about the rule of law? The biggest challenges today are, of course, the low standard of living, beyond doubt. But what about the rule of law? According to all the estimations by Freedom House, by all relevant international organizations, we are going backward. I mean, as a whole, if you're taking the look of the region, the whole Western Balkan is going back. Whenever you are speaking or judging the democratic indices, democratic indicators, then the quality of our democracy is not on that level it used to be before. We are going back. Then 5 years back, 10 years, 15 years back, we have been with the highest marks in this regard. I would dare say even to tell you that according to the latest reports by Freedom House or Amnesty International, in the whole of the Western Balkans, we have either serious leanings towards autocracy or outright autocratic regimes. That was not the case 10 or 15 years back. So we have enormously wasted the time. Especially, we have wasted the time of our young generations who are now either emigrating or looking in despair what's going on with their countries. Because, the promises after the fall of communism has been quite great. We have failed. Political leadership has failed. but the European dream is nowhere to be seen because of the inactivity, in my view, on the part of the European Union, mostly without excuse for the local leaderships. And one sentence plus, if I may. In the past 2.5 years, European Union all of a sudden started to think and to behave like the NATO alliance. They started to introduce informally some criteria for membership, which has something to do with the geostrategic context. And then you're hearing on a daily basis, this is the window of opportunity because of the war in Ukraine. You know, it shouldn't be like that. What if one day Ukraine war, hopefully today, not tomorrow, will stop? And we're going back to business as usual? You shouldn't say this is the window of opportunity because it is the war on the European continent. We do not need war to accept our countries into the European Union. We do not need that. We need presence of the European Union, judging us on all criteria, and acceleration process to be based on merits, not on geopolitical or geostrategic context.
Madame Ashton, I will use a sort of Macedonian legend now. It seems that maybe the Gordian knot to solve in the region is relations between Serbia and Kosovo. And you, ahead of the dialogue, the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, was the closest to becoming an Alexander the Great, compared to at least your successors, Federica Mogherini and Mr. Borrell, that quite frankly have not made any progress on that in the last 10 years. What is the secret sauce, and what is the EU not understanding about that very crucial relationship in the Western Balkans?
I've been compared to many things, but not that before.
Well, that's a compliment, isn't it?
I think he's a man, isn't he?
Doesn't matter.
Anyway, it's very nice to be here, and I'm very conscious that you do want to do questions, and we have 3 amazing presidents here, so I'll be brief. The thing that I look back on, and my frustration, is that what we were able to do 10 years ago was bring the determination and commitment of the leadership in Serbia and Kosovo together with the determination of the EU. People remember, if they remember at all, the hours I spent with the leadership of Serbia and Kosovo. What they probably don't know is how much time I spent with the leadership of the EU and the 28 member states, who had to be convinced of what I was doing as much as the leadership of Serbia and Kosovo. You need all of those ingredients to come together, and I completely understand that, especially those who have been ready and willing to go forward, that the constant feeling of not being able to quite get there is really frustrating. It requires the EU to be determined on the course as well. Doesn't excuse countries or leaders who have not done the work they should have done. And there's plenty of examples where that's the case, where they are content to put the blame on the EU. I'm not suggesting that's happening here, but in the region more broadly, they look at the EU and say, well, you don't let us in, so we won't do the work. Do the work anyway. The work of getting to become a member of the EU is good for your people, it's good for your democracy, it's good for your institutions, it's good for your future, it's good for your economic life, it's good for your ability to encourage investment, to offer opportunities, especially to the young. Do it anyway, but better still to be doing it because Europe is saying we're ready and waiting. And absolutely, it should not take a war on the European continent to make that more a reality or more possible. But we have got one, and in a sense, you have to use the moment to try and get some kind of progress. So I take no joy in the fact that the Brussels Agreement is over 10 years old and we're stuck. I would much rather have been, in that sense, part of the history, rather than feeling every time I go to the region that I'm still part of the current thinking and the current way forward. Always happy to help, but in a sense it needs to move on and move on to a place where the region is genuinely coming into the EU as quickly as possible. I
see it as the most upvoted question here. We're talking about the Brussels Agreement, and there's main question here is, there's still talk of the Dayton Accords impact on the Western Balkans. Would you say the agreement is holding the region together, or is it time for a revision? I'll throw that to you as well.
Personally, I think whenever you do an agreement, it is of the moment. So each agreement that I've been involved in, and many agreements that members here will have been involved in, you know that you are dealing with something that is going to do the job you need it to do then. The Dayton Agreement stopped a war. It created a framework to enable that to happen. But anyone looking at what's happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina will know that there are many issues that have not been resolved, and there are many ways in which the different parts find it difficult to come together. That's not the fault of the Dayton Agreement. That's the fault of the politics and the politicians who have followed. So you can solve everything if you choose to politically, because agreements only exist in a framework. You can say, well, we will find a way around this, we will find a way of doing it differently, we will find a way to create new agreements. So you need both things to happen. One is to look at Dayton and to see other things that we now need to reflect on, review, and change, perhaps. But you also need the political will to do that. If you can get those two things to come together, that would be a project, that would be something absolutely fantastic to be able to see that country go forward.
Okay, I will open the floor as well to questions if there are any. There are some housekeeping rules. Please introduce yourself, please ask a question, and please let me know to whom you're addressing the question to. Are there any hands up, or are we going to continue with the Slido? Any hands? No hands. So then, China, because there's a question here about the Belt and Road Initiative. How has that initiative affected the region? Adam?
Can I just respond to the
Sure,
question that you posed earlier to my North Macedonian colleague? Everything but institutions.
Yes.
Coming from Croatia, I'd say absolutely not. Because Montenegrin or North Macedonian or Bosnian Herzegovinian citizens are not second-rate citizens, and they will not be second-rate citizens of Europe. That would actually open very dangerous ideas and doors to these very dangerous ideas. If you look at the situation today and how it's being exploited by the third factions that I mentioned, look at the relationship between Croatia and Montenegro. And President Đukanović and myself, we put so much effort into normalizing the relationship, closing all the open issues. So what happens today? Serbia, with their desire of regional domination that is supported by Russia, wants to stir trouble in Montenegro and stop Montenegro on the way to the EU. So how do you do that? You empower those who are anti-EU. Empower anyone in Bosnia and Herzegovina by stepping away from the Dayton Peace Accords, for instance. The constitutional equality of the three nations has to remain as the basis of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's up to them to decide on their own future when it comes to the internal arrangements within Bosnia and Herzegovina. In the case of Montenegro, for instance, history, which is very powerful in the region. And I think that's one of the regions in Europe that is absolutely over-dominated by history. We're still fighting battles from World War II, even in Croatia. We spend too much time arguing about certain symbolic gestures or songs, etc., from World War II than we argue about the challenges that we're facing today, such as demographic challenges, the economy, the social system, etc. So we go back into the future. And how is that being exploited? By denying the future, by igniting the past. You go back to World War II and you make Montenegro, you stir populistic forces, and the Montenegrin parliament passes the resolution that honestly, and please don't take me wrong, but that I would publish on toilet paper because it means nothing. But what it does, it provokes adverse feelings from Croatia. and makes Croatia think, do we want to support Montenegro? And do we want to resolve all the remaining bilateral issues between our two countries before Montenegro is able to make progress on the way to the EU? So what have you done? You have empowered those who are against. And believe me, there are so many people against in all of our countries, and who are exploiting populism, who are exploiting nationalism, who are exploiting greater national ideologies, and then stir emotions among the people, who are then made to believe, as I said, whatever we do, no matter how far we go, no matter what you ask us, we do it, and we're still not good enough. And then it brings me to the elephant in the room, and that is Ukraine. I wholeheartedly support Ukraine and Ukraine's accession to the EU. But I have to say that I was personally deeply disappointed on the day when Ukraine was given candidature status, that Bosnia and Herzegovina was not. And that there were countries, my neighbors, who have done a lot of homework in the meantime. We do speak about stalled reforms, but there's also incredible work that all of these countries have done. So we need to pinpoint to that work. We need to reward that work. And we need for that work to be followed by very concrete agenda and very concrete schedules when it comes to their accession to the European Union. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen, because people themselves are going to say, we don't want this any longer.
Gentlemen, do you want to answer to the President on this issue, or on China, for that matter?
Only shortly, we have frozen our activities in that Belt and Road initiative. You know why? Because we have few negative experiences in this regard. We have taken some loans as a country then a decade ago, and in the meantime, they have not been quite successful on the terrain, because whenever China is giving you the loan there, they would like their enterprises to be on the terrain, not the local workers to be engaged in. And after all of these years working with them directly, we have finally realized, I know that well before, but some people have finally realized that whenever you're getting some loans from China, that's not only an economic category. Every loan from China, every loan by anywhere in the world is coming with the political values behind that, or political messages behind that. So I do not think that North Macedonia should be attached to that values which are coming with the Chinese loans and Chinese infrastructure initiatives in the region, especially in my country.
Mr. President, do you?
Hoću. Vratio bih se ovim povodom na jednu ocjenu koju sam već dao. Dakle, ja mislim...
I think that it is very important that at the top of European politics, they understand that we live in the time where the new geopolitical architecture is being built. Cold War is over, and the stage of the monopoly by one superpower is also at the end. We are facing new geopolitical architecture, which is going to be polycentric. And we need to see where Europe is in that new architecture. So instead of being surprised with China, and instead of having some centers in the West waging economic war against China, they should have recognized in time that China has potentials to be a global player. And okay, we now see that, but we are late, because this already happened. China has already become an important player. They started building Southeastern Europe 25 years ago. At that time, I had a conversation with a friend from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it was a summit 16+1, China plus 16 countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And he asked me, why are you doing this? Why are you taking their initiatives? I told him, well, we are doing and accepting something that you are not doing. We are not helping China to become a global player, but we want to help European institutions to recognize that they should provide funds for infrastructural integration of the region of Central and Eastern Europe. And in Europe, they didn't do it. So if the Chinese companies in Europe come with the dumping of prices because they have subsidies from their state, it's clear that European Union or European Commission should take responsibility to define the trade rules with China. Montenegro and Macedonia and Croatia can't do it. European Union has to do it. So European Union has to take full responsibility for competitiveness of Europe in the global scene. We keep saying that Europe does not have clearly defined strategic policies, defense policy, foreign trade policy. It's non-existent. Today, we talk about trade policy. I think that Europe finally has to take responsibility. I was very happy when I heard the President of the European Commission yesterday. She said that the Minister of Defense will be in the Commission, and let's make it the first step. I think that Europe is not present in certain important fields where they should meet their obligations, not only in the Western Balkans. This is my comment regarding China. And when it comes to responsibility of Europe, and Mr. Pendarovski mentioned this, responsibility of Europe in our region, I told you, I see that now we are in the third stage of relations between the West, or attitude of the West towards Western Balkans. And in this third stage, I don't see Europe as the key holder of responsibilities. On the level of the narrative, they say Europe is conducting the policy and others support Europe. No, it's State Department that conducts this policy. And not from Blinken's cabinet, because the Western Balkan policy in the last couple of years never entered White House. It's led from the middle leadership level, and it is wrong, completely wrong. And Europe follows that, and that's why we are where we are. I think that Europe must take responsibility in a much clearer way for certain key interests of all parts of Europe, and Western Balkans is a part of Europe. And if they leave Western Balkans to be the place where all anti-European policies will be allowed to enter, then it's a disaster for Europe, and Europe will not be competitive on the geopolitical level.
About 3 minutes left. And, I'm still at that crossroad, and maybe Balkans is as well. So I'm going to start over here now to Catherine, and then we go back this way. In order for me not to come back here in 10 years, or maybe at the Munich Security Conference talking about the same thing again, what is the one policy thing the EU or the countries in the Western Balkans should focus on? One policy idea in order to get away from this crossroad and select, well, preferably the West.
It's really quite simple. The policy is that the Western Balkans belongs in the European Union. Full stop. If you put a helicopter over Europe, it's very obvious. If you think about the people, the economies, the landmass, any way you slice it, you end up at the same conclusion. So the policy is very simple. We have to get these countries ready and able to be part of the European Union, and we should do it in good time. The thing about politics is momentum, in my view. That many of the things that President Đukanović was just talking about is when things slow down, and this has certainly happened in North Macedonia, that everybody gets stuck, and then those who would try and disrupt or antagonize or turn people away from Europe have a great time, because they say, well, look, this is pointless, they don't want you, there's an alternative. So it's political momentum and a policy that says, you belong in the European Union, to the nations, we belong in the European Union, and it's the priority. And the final thing to say in the context of the US is, the reason, or one of the many reasons I got involved in the Brussels Agreement and trying to do that work, was to show that Europe was capable of resolving issues in its own backyard and didn't need to rely on the US to come in and actually tell us what to do. In this case, we were in the leadership role, and that's where Europe should be, and this should be the number one issue.
Very, very quickly, Mr. Pendarovski, the one thing.
First of all, European Union should be more present in the region. with a clear policy. But why that's not going to happen? Within a few seconds I have left, I can explain. I cannot explain a bit more. European Union, regardless of the internal structure, but as a sum of all the activities they are doing, European Union is a heterogeneous organization, 27 member countries. It's not possible to have Brussels is not equal to Washington, D.C., so it's not possible to have one policy for each of the vital areas. But anyhow, European Commission plus European Parliament should come up forward with the policies in the crucial areas, including the real integration of the Western Balkan countries, not only the rhetoric about integration.
I know time is up, but Mr. Đukanović, final, very, very short, the one thing we need.
Već sam kazao manje više sve na tu temu. Znate, reći ću vam sljedeće. U Europskoj...
In the European administration, there are thousands of people working on this, and in the European External Action Service, and in the Enlargement Directorate, and they are not dealing with hundreds of countries. They are dealing with 5, 6 countries. Teams should be established, and people should be focused to spend 6 months to 1 year in the country of the Western Balkans that they work for to help the public there and the governments there and those structures there to achieve the standards, to recommend them for membership. Nobody requests to have lower criteria. We don't want to have double criteria. Criteria should be high. Requirements should be high, but we need support, not financial, but expert, professional, and then we can solve everything.
Final words. The EU should realize the strength of its transformative power in Southeast Europe, that it's still in its hands, but not for much longer.
Thank you very much. Ladies and ladies, please a big applause for the panel. Thank you. We're now gonna have some Turkish coffee out there, and then come back in a few minutes. There's another panel on integrating defense domains. Thank you very much. Thank you.